Great. All right, so happy to introduce Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon. So she currently holds the chaired professorship of climate change policy at University of Cambridge. She's involved in many activities, so I'm not going to read most of them. She's the director of the Center for Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Governance at Cambridge. And she's a research associate, a longtime research associate at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. And that's what she's doing this year. She's visiting Harvard Kennedy School. And I met her first, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, where she was an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She was associate director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy Program and co-principal investigator of the Energy Technology Innovation Policy, which I think that's where we connected the most, was through ETIP. I'd say she kind of embodies Elevate and ETI in many ways. She's got a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Cambridge. She's got a master's in public policy. And I feel like you're kind of largely self-taught with economics research, right? She does a lot of very impactful economics research.
We did do a lot of economics courses in the master's.
In the master's, yeah.
So yeah, not quite.
But does an amazing economics research, considering that no economics PhD. So like I said, I've known her for more than 10 years. We've worked on a number of projects, especially that involve combining expert judgment with energy modeling to get insights into policy. I also have to say she's the person who introduced me to Anna Goldstein, the executive director at ETI, and for that, we're all particularly grateful. So thank you, Laura, for that. So with that, please welcome Professor Anadon.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I was telling some of you the Elevate Fellows and the WINA Fellows that it's my first in-person talk in 2 years. So it's great to have the opportunity to come here. I just drove from Boston a few hours ago. As Erin mentioned, I've covered a range of areas in our center. In Cambridge, we have lawyers, engineers, physicists, sociologists, geographers, economists. So we really have a program. So some of the faculties are less interdisciplinary than me. So we have some lawyers, some economists, and all of this. And actually, the first project I did working on this interface between engineering and economics was really this project on how to introduce uncertainty into energy economic models. And actually, our paper with Valentina Bossetti in Nature Energy continues to be one of the papers that I think, that I really like talking about because it does bridge various things. So I'm going to be talking about some of the areas that are working on. There's some pieces I won't be able to talk to. So it's not a research talk in the sense that I'll be presenting one paper. I'll talk about various things that might have the broadest interest. And to conclude, I'll try to argue that there are some pieces of the puzzle that will be necessary to solve to have a just transition that I think we're beginning to put them together, but I think it's kind of surprising that it's taking us so long. And again, I'm very well aware, especially after having talked to some of your fellows, that there are also many pieces that are already happening also here at the Energy Technology Institute. So let me just start with something that most of you already know, but I think this is the starting point for some of the work that I'll mention, which is that, as we all know, the current emissions here, this is a paper from 2020, are really not on track with the 2-degree goal of the Paris Agreement or the aspirational goal. We're already off 1.5 degrees. We're already at 1.2 degree Celsius over pre-industrial levels. And, just thinking about the carbon intensity of the global economy, even though, as I will show in a little bit, we've made really great strides in developing and reducing the cost of a lot of the technologies that we're going to need, we're still only decarbonizing the carbon intensity of energy production, both power and other types of primary energy. It's only been decreasing at around 0.1% per year over the past 5 years, excluding, of course, the pandemic. So we're still decarbonizing at this level. Actually, if you do, using just the Kaya identity, which again, many of you, I'm sure you're familiar with, I'll show it in a second, we need to increase the rate of decrease of decarbonization of carbon intensity by more than an order of magnitude, right? So it's just, we have to go from 1.1% a year to 2% a year at least. And just as a little bit of an update, when we think about this is with the latest nationally determined contributions and the pledges that were made in the Glasgow November 2021 meeting. These are the NDCs. This is the, you cannot really see it, but this is the 2-degree path, 1.5 degree. We're now more in the 2-degree trajectory, even if you assume that everything that was pledged in Glasgow comes to fruition. And again, if history is any, we cannot really count on this, right? So we're really not here. So most of my work, not all of my work, but most of my work over the past 15 years since I left chemical engineering has been in this area of energy innovation. And just as a motivation why this is important, I'll talk in a second about what I mean by energy innovation, is that, high identity or IPAD, depending on whether you come from Japan and, Dr. Kaya, or you are more from the California tradition, is this very simple identity, right? And energy innovation really affects all of these things, and of course, indirectly, population and things like this. So energy innovation affects the carbon intensity of energy per GDP. Here's where we would put things like energy efficiency. And it can also, and I will talk a little bit about the interaction between innovation and energy innovation and productivity. It also affects, again, more indirectly in a way that is very hard to measure, but you can also see routes for this. So energy innovation is really something that shapes a lot of these drivers. So one thing that I think most of us also recognize is the net zero emissions, getting to net zero regardless of when, right? Whether it's 2050 or 2060 like China, 2070 like India, in terms of what their pledges, is not viable without innovation. And what do I mean by innovation? Because there are different definitions. It's the process by which technology is conceived, developed, codified, and deployed. Right, so here in the definition of innovation, I'm including, and many people who think about it in terms of an innovation system, we include technology deployment, yeah? And most of you have probably seen, well, certainly those of you involved in the Energy Transitions Institute, this graph by the International Energy Agency, showing that, again, to get to net zero, in this case here by 2070 globally, there are some technologies that will require that are already mature. Think about your solar panels and things like this. That doesn't mean that they won't keep improving, that they're static, but when you think about technology readiness levels, which is one of the useful ways to think about technology, they're in the highest of the TRLs, but some of them are prototypes, demonstration, and even I would argue, even before large prototypes. So we don't have all of the technologies we need. And I think there are some areas in which we are more in this area, right? So we have the industrial hard to decarbonize sectors, shipping, transport, and firm power generation to complement renewables. So there are some areas where we know more effort is needed. So when we think about innovation, this is again this figure, and I think the reason I like this figure, which we put together for a report to the UK government. We've been working, and I was telling some of your colleagues on various roles, as I'm one of the members of the Economics of Decarbonization Advisory Group for Treasury, is that you have this innovation process, which goes from research and diffusion, some of it is in parallel, there are feedbacks, but we have these two large categories of policies. We have the technology push policies and the demand pull policies. And on this bar below, what we can see is different indicators that are generally used to understand the level of activity, to attribute causality to, or to assess causality between different policies, push policies, pull policies, and different stages of the innovation process. So I just wanted to put this up because one of the things that I'll be showing later is an assessment that we did on what is it that we know about the impact of different policy instruments on different innovation indicators. So the last kind of introductory slide to further frame why I think this area is very important in a climate context is that innovation not only is necessary to reduce emissions, it shapes again the cost of affordable, so it helps reduce the cost of getting to net zero. It also affects the transition cost to workers, businesses, and vulnerable communities. But it also affects the benefits and positive impacts of promoting green technologies. So it also shapes things like new industries, competitiveness, the winners and the losers, health outcomes from reduced air pollution, ecosystem services. So there was a very nice review, a little bit like the Stern review for climate change. One of our colleagues in my college, actually in Cambridge, produced the one for ecosystem services and biodiversity. So we can have, there are all of these things that are affected by what is it that we deploy. And I think the key thing here, and those of you who are familiar with Mariana Mazzucato's work, this is a little bit of the language she's been using. I think many of us, including Erin, Anne and I have been talking about this in the past, is that the direction and nature of innovation matters. So it matters how we do this, what technologies we support or adopt, and also, the how, so the what and the how. And this is, again, it's a little bit hard to see, but this is just a graph that we produced as part of a local effort, a policymaking effort that I'm involved with in the Independent Commission on Climate Change, where we look at all of these connections that, again, we all know through the SDGs that exist there, but I think innovation really does interact with all of them. And the last point, I forgot there was this one, we do know that innovation not only interacts with economic development, with health impact, but it also affects the politics of getting to net zero. I mean, if you think about where we were in terms of the political science of coalitions, of voters, public opinion, back in 2007-10, there were very few political scientists that were working on this space, that were working on environmental issues. Now we have a really great set of empirical papers, insights on indicating that the perception about competitiveness benefits, jobs from decarbonization policies can help or affect public opinion and vote. So it's also a very salient policy goal, especially during the pandemic. And also we know that the political economy of innovation also affects not just voters, but also politics at the higher level. It can affect what policies become sticky, what policies make it through or don't. So I think we've really gotten to understand that we need to think about the technologies that are needed or that are out there in a dynamic way, because they interact with voters, they interact with interest groups, they interact with vulnerable communities. So now I'll go into, and I've worked on these various things. Now I'll move on to a couple of the new things that I think we've learned in this topic of energy innovation and interaction with some of these outcomes. The first thing that I think is worth mentioning is that we have learned a lot over the past 10 years, especially about the costs and diffusion of different energy technologies. Here I'm just putting up, again, there are more of these from different reports. Some of them are from papers we've written, some of them are from just industry reports. And what you can see is that the cost of key climate mitigation technologies has come down very quickly, especially over the past 10 years in terms of consistently. And we know that for PV, lithium-ion batteries, solid state lighting, they have come down by 80 to 90% in 10 years. When it comes to on and offshore wind, around 50%, 47%. So this has been really huge. And again, I'll show you a couple more things. And I think this is really changing. And this is something that the UK government really tried to do. In Glasgow, they really tried to focus on let's try, this is not, by the way, saying that I think they got things right. This is just saying that one of the things that they were trying to say with the breakthrough tax and various initiatives was to say, maybe we can get some agreement on getting down the costs of some of these things. And this partly reflecting the fact that we are beginning to understand that these cost reductions have been massive, but most importantly, we're beginning to understand what made them possible. And the first point I'd like to make is that actually nobody really, at least over the past few years, nobody really foresaw, both either using models or using expert opinion, quite how fast these cost reductions were going to be. And this is something that we really tested for the first time, as far as I know, in a PNAS paper that came out just 6 months ago. And what we've been looking at this for a long time, as Erin knows, and looking at doing expert elicitations, learning curves, probabilistic approaches, and all of this. And working on an EU project, one of the things I realized, and with my colleagues, is that we didn't really know what method was better, right? Which one did better? So kind of validation. I did a lot of modeling work as an engineer. I did experimental work, and then you see what is predicted, but nobody had really done it for this. And we, and a lot of us have been doing a lot of this work on uncertainty. So we tested whether or not, or which type of forecasting tool was better at predicting the cost reductions that we see, right? So there are different forecasting. This is kind of the area of technology forecasting. So we talk about different types of approaches. Some of them are the expert-based approaches. And again, we can talk about, just asking a lot of the models, not all of them, but just go and ask somebody at NREL and say, hey, what is the cost of wind going to be in 2030? And they get that number, right? So that's the unstructured expert input. Then you have Delphi methods, expert elicitations, and prediction markets, right? Gathering masses. So there are a lot of different types. We use this one because we have data on this. We have a lot of information on this from many groups around the world, including our own. And then in terms of model-based forecasting, there are a lot of different approaches, and a paper by Jessica Tratzek really laid out some of this very nicely. So they're saying costs are going to come down as a function of time, or as a function of deployment, or time and deployment, or scale-based things. And we use these two because those are the ones that have been most widely used and also tested to some extent. These are just, this is what I mean. Hopefully those, most of you are familiar with this sort of thing. Just saying over time, notice that these are in the kind of future. These are normally deterministic approaches. So our research questions in this paper, I'll get quickly, and because what I care about, yes, this was a cool paper, I love this paper, but the key point here is that we really underestimated how quickly things would come down. And we also saw that, again, for how these analyses were made, there was a particular type of approach was more effective. So we wanted to know which one had done better predicting 2019 technology costs. And then we also wanted to see, well, if you use these different approaches going to 2030, which is an important timeline for technologies, do we see any systematic differences if you use experts when compared to when you use some of these models? So we collected data, harmonized it, generated forecasts. Again, this is all, and I should say that because we did probabilistic forecasts, we use, this was again not simple. And then we generated this forecast. There are two different types of probabilistic forecasts based on data. One which we call the stochastic shock method, which was based on work by Joan Farmer at Oxford, who was at the Santa Fe Institute, and then another modified version of something that one of your next speakers is proposed in 2009. Greg Nemeth actually proposed one, and we modified it to remove correlations over time. So we did all of this, and I'll show you the results very quickly because I want to move to the rest. These are some of the figures of the paper, but basically what you see is that these are box plots. We have the full distribution, of course. Here you have the actual data in 2019, and these are the distributions in black using expert-based methods, and the colors are using some of the model-based methods. And there are two things that stand out. The model forecast, again, for this set of, for the technologies where we could do things comparably. So what we did is that we used the model-based forecast only using data up to the year when the elicitations were made, so that, obviously, if you use the most recent data, you cannot compare data for 2016, predicting 2019 with an elicitation that was done in 2009, right? So we have some limitations to make a fair comparison. The model-based methods, when you look at the 5th to 95th percentile, in 5 out of 6 cases, or sorry, in 6 out of 6 cases, they included the mean value, but the experts, only one of them, and actually is your elicitation, that including the range. So we found that models were better than experts, and these are real experts, actually, as you said. And then the second, that in all methods, this was, I think, more interesting because I think, and we argue that you can improve on all of these things on both types of methods. The interesting thing is that both types of approaches underestimated the rate of technological change. I think this is actually a good thing. I think this is showing, again, obviously this is not something we can claim based on this paper. We cannot say we weren't looking at what caused this, but I think, and I will show you in a second why, the range of policies, the range of, the changes we're seeing in different sectors of society may be the cause of why using previous data, for example, might not help, may underestimate the pace of change.
I have a question though of the figures. So basically those figures that you're showing over there are like all the data that you collect, the tables you mentioned before, and I think it's the forecast year, that is the forecasted year for using the different models, right? The right model, more model, and experimentation, right? Okay,
No, thanks. So anyway, and the thing, when you look at 2030, you actually do get a very different result. If you use the model-based methods, so these are the ones, like these are the model-based methods, you get two things. You have the experts are actually more pessimistic than the models, and then they're much more confident. They're more overconfident, or well, they're overconfident. So what do we have a few things here. We have uncertainty, but we have this underestimation of impacts. I think that the explanation comes in something that we cover in other work that I'm going to show you. So there's a growing research trying to study the effectiveness or the impact of different policies that have been put in place, at least partly, but not only, to decarbonize our economy. We are seeing some improvement in diffusion. So when you look at the share of electricity that comes from renewables, we are seeing, again, some progress. Again, I think actually I was surprised when I saw this data that we are in all of these countries, a greater share of electricity comes from renewables. But when you think, and when you look at the data on primary energy and diffusion, we cannot be complacent, right? So we still have a long way to go. We still have around 80% of total final energy consumption coming from fossil fuels, and this is where we were 10 years ago. So we have not made progress in terms of final energy consumption. So what has happened when we think about the technologies, the diffusion of some of them? Well, we have seen a huge number of policies across the world, but initially mainly in industrialized countries. Here, this plot is in 2010, and what we see is that it's about 145 countries have put in place regulatory policies in power. A smaller number of countries, 65 in transport. So you can see this. And then we have around 22% of emissions that are covered by some sort of price on carbon, cap and trade, or a carbon tax. And we have around 80% of emissions with net zero targets, most of them not binding. So and of course, when we go back in time, we think about the 90s, the 2000s, there were also policies in place. So we do have a plethora at this point of policies that have been put in place. And that also means there's been much more research on this. So I've, like many of you here, I've been looking individually at different, feed-in tariffs in Germany, at the contracts for differences in the UK for offshore wind, at R&D funds, ARPA, collaborations. But what we try to do as part of a project is to try to understand what is it that researchers like us have been able to determine in terms of the impact of these different types of policies on different outcomes. And here is where I go back to the introduction, where I said, well, these policies, the decarbonization really touches a lot of different goals. So, I guess I added this slide, and what I wanted to say is that we have a lot of case study evidence, and I think, again, you have the Mehmet coming up, who wrote an amazing book on solar. I think I put together this as part of various other things, and what we see is that when you look at the case evidence of things like lithium-ion batteries, solid-state lighting, we see that it's very hard to explain what happened without some of the technology push policies, R&D investments, national labs, mobility grants, but also pull policies. So lithium-ion batteries, which is one where you've seen less work trying to explain the impact that different policies have had in the technology. We had work by the Department of Defense. Here, USAID, you had the British government, you had the Japanese government funding some of the R&D there. This is where the Nobel Prize winners come from. Then you had, a kind of a completely just a spillover effect of some of the work that had been done in the wake of the oil crisis, developing batteries for vehicles that then went into Sony doing work on the camcorder. But then this is the kind of learning curve just for personal electronics. The data available then for automotive, starts here. And why was it? Well, it's because here is when the jump was made between electronics, consumer electronics, to vehicles. And this is when a lot of the policies were put in place, not just the recovery plan and the loan to Tesla by the US Department of Energy, but also purchase incentives, rebates, tax incentives for registration for lithium-ion batteries or for electric vehicles all over the world. So again, this is not, I'll show you now the papers that look at things more, using econometrics and then trying to do a better job with causality. But when you see some of these things, this is just when the data became available, because that's when started making them. And now, of course, this is the first Tesla. And the interesting thing is that, of course, we have now around 10% of all sales of vehicles are electric vehicles. In Norway, where they've had incentives for a long time, is 65%. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. So this paper to me is useful for teaching, and also because I think it really informs a lot of, some of the work that we've done with the Treasury. We did a systematic review. Again, we have some papers that are included as part of the systematic review of all the literature, mainly from economics, policy, but also there's work from management, business, and these various disciplines. We explain all of this in this Nature Climate Change paper. And what we looked at is 10 different policy instruments, some technology push, some market pull, that have been used to, again, partly decarbonize the economy, but also I think we're seeing more evidence that, an important, if not a primary objective, was to develop competitiveness and domestic manufacturing in that particular area. And here I'm just showing you what we looked at is we did this review, all of the papers that tried to isolate the impact of just a single policy instrument on various outcomes. So what were the outcomes we looked at? Well, first, we looked at deployment, which is part of innovation, but we were interested in seeing the difference, right? This is, do you actually get technologies on the ground? This is not very, very surprising. This I could explain what this is. This is just a particular type of technology that gets pushed out. But blue means there was a positive impact. Gray, the study didn't identify an impact. And orange, it was a negative impact. It's very difficult, or it's impossible to quantify, to standardize the magnitude of the impact on all of these things. And some of the metrics are a little bit different. So this is just saying, was there a positive impact or a negative impact or no impact? Most of them, this is not surprising. If you subsidize wind farms, you get wind farms on the ground, right? In innovation, you also, for most of them, you also get some impact. I mean, in some cases, many studies, in like the emissions trading scheme in the EU, for example, is an area where some papers detect an increase in patents or increase in exports or reduction in cost. So there are different innovation metrics that I showed in the previous slide. Now, again, this is something I wanted to show. We have more papers that look at ETS, but here the numbers is like 20, here is 4 for carbon taxes. So, there are many discussions about what is more effective at incentivizing innovation. Is it a cap and trade versus a tax? So we have, we could dwell on this a little bit, but this is what I really wanted to focus.
Are these all empirical studies, or are some of the models?
So we classify. So if you look at this, so this is theoretical ex ante.
Oh, I see.
So actually, you cannot see it very well here. The majority are empirical, but many are also there's a few that are like this. So we indicated that it explains some of it, but most of it is actually not explained by the methodology of the paper, but it really depends. But this is what I really wanted to show. When you look at competitiveness impacts and distributional impacts, you notice that there's more orange, right? So I think we're really, I remember again, when I moved into the space, it was many people were saying this is win-win-win, we can have it all. And I think really the experience, the rich experience that we've had over the past 20 years suggests that yes, okay, we have been actually wildly successful at getting down the cost of some of these technologies, that you get deployment, innovation. Some obviously tools are more effective than others, but we cannot longer ignore these things. And I know that there are efforts, of course. We have our own work in Europe doing this with some of the various modeling teams. I know there's the macro energy systems, right, that is going to be tackling at this. But right now, this is an issue that I think we have very consistent evidence across geographies, groups of workers, communities, where you really cannot say that there are no. This doesn't mean, by the way, this distributional impact. These are not long-term, impacts that over the whole lifetime. This means that at least in the short to medium term, some negative distributional impacts on some communities have been detected. That doesn't mean that overall we're not going to be better off, but that means that there are these costs. And this, for those of you who are interested, this is very useful for identifying research steps. We have an online tool that allows you to look at the effects, look at the metric, look at the geography at the sector. Again, this is an EU project. So one big thing to say here before I move to the very last thing, I know I should finish in a couple of minutes, is that not surprisingly, these papers covered mostly the OECD, China, India, not Brazil, right? So when it comes to what works in developing countries, in terms of even just the innovation or the decarbonization, the evidence is really not there most of the time. I'm doing, and it's not because they're not putting in place any policies. So actually the World Bank has a database on some of this, and I'm working on a project with a previous PhD student and colleagues in the World Bank, where we're looking at these policies, especially in Africa, but also Latin America. And the tentative work we're hoping to publish soon is that actually these policies are not having the same impact on deployment or innovation. Well, on innovation we have less information, but we cannot, with the evidence that we have, assumed that on the first two indicators that I talked about, deployment and innovation, that they will have the same impact. Obviously, there are different institutional setting, capabilities, innovators. So again, it's something that is intuitive, but we just didn't have the data, but the papers, but what we're seeing now is that some of the recipes that we are beginning to identify work to get technology costs down, the R&D, the demonstration, having some sense that you'll be able to sell the product at a price, it's unclear that they're going to work there. And let me just, move on to finish, which is a third component. So I talked about these distributional impacts at the cost, the uncertainty, the breadth of policies. And I think another area of interest in various groups around the world is trying to understand a little bit more why some technologies go faster than others, and the extent to which complexity in design or complexity in the value chain may be factors that are associated with different possible speed of technology cost reductions. So these are some of the relevant literatures, again, not just our own, but also of colleagues. And there are all these concepts on technology complexity, mass production, standardization. And the one piece that I will mention, since I know that many of you are working on wind, is a paper led by Kavita Surana, who was at Maryland, now it's in Austria, where we looked at the value chain of wind. So not just the original equipment manufacturers, but also down to the component manufacturers. Here we use different metrics of complexity, using patents, using trade, the product space that Cesar Hidalgo pioneers, so different ways of measuring complexity. It's not easy. So let me start with that. We're doing much more work on this. But in this paper, we looked at increased complexity from the tower to generators, control system blade, gearbox. We have 9, I think, in total. This is in 2006. This is in 2016. You cannot really read it, but basically the key message here is that when you look at 2006, okay, you have from 2006 to 2016, you have many more countries. You have more lines here. What this means is that more countries have been able to manufacture this. So only a few countries were making towers in 2006. 10 years later, you had a lot. So it's easy to do. Now, when you go to more complex components, actually you don't see very much change, right? With the same sort of countries that were doing it, we're doing it there. So there are, I see this all the time, interacting with the OECD, with country governments. Of course, everybody wants to, give the best to their citizens, have a competitive economy, benefit from climate reductions, but also from, a piece of this growing industry. But the reality is that it's some, both on the technology side and on the economy, on your own capability side, some things are harder than others. And I think this is also where we're going with the conversation. We're doing a lot on this with also the Department of Trade and Industry in the UK, where they're thinking, well, what can you possibly do domestically versus not? Again, incentivize in some way. So this is subject to both measuring complexity with patents, metrics, and as well as with exports. And just one example of this is looking at a very clear effort by India in this case to introduce local content requirements for solar panels. So they had options, and in some of them they were open, some of them weren't. So we were able to determine the impact that having local content requirements for making solar panels in India had on the cost. And we see two things. One, the cost of solar panels came down a lot. Of course, this also happened because of policies elsewhere, manufacturing globally. So this is not driven only by India's solar options, but we see obviously the closed options, those that had local content requirements were higher. So what you would expect, you have a restriction on where you manufacture things, and the power for the people was 6% higher. So you had a cost, and we looked at, okay, what was the benefit? With this cost, they canceled the program after 3 years. They didn't do anything else. So they didn't have the systemic perspective of what is it that you need, what R&D you have. So and I've also worked more broadly on the Indian system here. So it was just a very single policy that resulted in higher costs, 6%. And we looked at what was happening. This was 3 years that this lasted. They did manufacture solar panels there, but they didn't really have the impacts that they wanted in terms of export. So they weren't exporting, the capacity factor of those plants was very low, they weren't used, they weren't having good results. So this is just to say that even though that some of these policies, if you don't have them as part of a system, they can have costs and not deliver the benefits you want. Let me just finish. I know I need to finish. What are the key messages? So I think we all probably agree with this. We need a more inclusive, sustainable, resilient society. I think it's clear from all of these things, and when you look at the histories, from the lithium-ion battery to, again, I've done a lot of the solid-state lighting, PV, and wind. It's clear that it would not have been possible to be where we are now without the various policies that have been put in on entrepreneurship and private actors around the world. But again, I think it's clear that without the policies, it wouldn't have happened. But we need something else, right? We started with the 0.1% carbon intensity. We need something else. So yes, we went faster than we thought in some areas. We just need something much bigger. We know that strategic investment, incentives, regulation, when they're well designed, and of course, again, I mentioned the example of the local content requirement in India. Again, they've done great things in solar lighting, so this is just one particular paper that we looked at one particular policy, but we have now a lot of evidence. Again, those circles were based on, well, a big review, but ultimately only 550 evaluations in 217 papers. I think we need to move more towards this, looking at different technologies. And I, just from a European perspective, I don't know if you've ever heard, I hadn't heard about it being here. So when I moved I was here for 8 years at Harvard, and then have been in Europe for 6. Everybody was talking about smart specialization, right? Everybody in Europe wanted to specialize on the same things, right? On the nanotech, biotech, all of this. And I think we have enough evidence that suggests that no, it's not that governments can pick and know what is going to work, but at least inform some of the areas of focus based on the level of complexity of different technologies and also the capabilities of the industrial production system. I think also I didn't really talk, I skipped this slide, but I think we also have some evidence that, and I can point to a report, cost benefits analysis, which is in the US is required for regulations, in many other places in the world is too, is something that may not be as useful of a decision-making tool for policymakers as when you're not looking at just an incremental change. If we need a big change in the economy, we need to think about other ways of making decisions. And in fact, all of these policies that I mentioned, Germany's feed-in tariffs, the contracts for differences in the UK, they would not have passed a cost-benefit analysis. So they happen in spite of the fact that they do cost-benefit analysis because somebody goes and says, hey, we want to do this. They never thought that it would happen like that fast. Those of you who have seen the cost and capacity factors of offshore wind in the UK, nobody thought it would happen. They still did it, but they did it in spite of cost-benefit analysis, not because of cost-benefit analysis. And finally, again, I cannot put everybody here. Yes, I haven't. Thank you very much. I mean, I tried to give you a broad overview. I hope some of it is helpful. Thank you. Bueno,
Thanks very much. Mentioned you said wrote a paper in 2012 about missions around energy, and all of that seems to emphasize that government investments are important beyond the R&D stage, and not just as procurement, but actually, all those concessional investments by state development banks, for instance, or by government agencies. I didn't see that much in your review, and I know a few other recent reviews that say there isn't a lot of evidence around there, but it seems important. I was wondering what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, so we had 10 policy instruments. We actually, in the online tool, we have gaps for when we are able to get around the rest. We do have loans and grants, but that's not one of the ones we populated. We had to kind of pick. The best work on the green banks, state banks, was actually work by Toby Schmidt at ETH Zurich. The one they did, I think, Australia, they did German bank, and the UK Green Bank, which was created and then disappeared. I know Mariana Mascato has also written about this. So yes, this was just a set of policies that we ended up choosing, and partly it was because it was a big project. We had modelers, so. But yes, I didn't want to de-emphasize. Yeah, I agree that that's an important area. I think what we are seeing, we're continuing to work on this EISC project, which is funded by the equivalent of the Department of Energy in the UK and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. We have partners in the government in China, India, not Brazil. In Brazil is the University of Rio. And in this project, we're kind of going a little further in terms of, we're actually going to come up with some, what are some of the common things that rules of thumb, if you like, that policymakers in some of these countries and in the UK usually have, right? So one of the things that we're seeing in the UK and in the EU, there's a debate about, yes, there's a carbon price, it's a carbon price floor in the UK. There's a European trading scheme, a carbon trading scheme. Some decision makers are under the impression that that is going to be enough. And again, I think all of this evidence suggests that it's not. I mean, I think it's really important. So I've argued publicly that we should have one that covers more sectors, that goes up over time. But I think we know that that's just not going to, especially with a carbon trade system where you have volatility of price. And what we're seeing, when you think about some of these incentives, you have just many papers looking at renewable fuel standards versus feed-in tariffs. What is the difference? Well, in one, you have a fixed certainty about price. So of course, if you know you're going to sell something, if you know that it's going to be bought and that the price that is going to be bought at, people invest. So it's not kind of magic, it's understandable, but I think that there's the importance of volatility in prices in investors' decisions to try to move things forward. This has been generally underestimated. I mean, I could say a lot more about this one, about the volatility, but I mean, the good news, the Spanish government, this was an announcement just 2 days ago. Now they're applying some of these lessons for green hydrogen. So there was an announcement made just a couple of days ago for the largest green hydrogen hub. It happens to be in Spain, which is where I'm from. I often give bad examples from Spain. This is, I think, a good example. So they got ArcelorMittal, which has a big manufacturing facility there, and Fertiberia, a big fertilizers company. They're going to buy hydrogen made with electrolysis, and they're kind of taking this, okay, we're buying it at a fixed price, 1.5 euros per kilogram of hydrogen. And it seems like that is going to, 9 gigawatts of solar to then scale up and reduce the cost of electrolyzers. So some of this is going in that direction of learning from this experience. Yeah.
So a lot of the mature innovations nowadays of solar wind batteries have benefited a lot from government funding in the early stages. But there's also the notion that because of this process, governments can cherry pick, and so the best technology won't necessarily rise to the top. So what are your thoughts about the process of funding and whether it really does help the best technology become mature?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously a hard question, but I think there are, some people take that, okay, we have to be completely technology neutral, right? And then, but it's very hard. I think one should do that to the largest extent possible, but it would not have been, it's just very hard to see how some of these, what would have been a good alternative to the solar feed-in tariffs. So I think we're at a point in which some of the paths seem clearer now. So we know we need some sort of firm power, then there are a lot of preferences, a lot of local considerations that need to be made to see, well, is this something that has to be, going to be nuclear, is it going to be batteries or geothermal, some other hydro, pumped hydro. So in some of these areas where it's not clear what the answer is, I think a combination of, let's try to get competition, let's try to get new ideas. You need some of, I guess you need some of those, but in the case of, things like heat pumps at this point, right? Where, even just a few years ago, people were talking about hydrogen heating. I think we're getting to a point where it's hard to justify that for residential heating, you should do hydrogen. So when we kind of know what it's going to be, but why people are not doing it, the UK has very old buildings, they really need to be, mandating, subsidizing for obviously for communities until costs really come down. So I think for some areas, it's justifiable to do more than what we're doing. But what you mentioned is really important that we don't lock in the wrong answer. So that's, in other presentations I do, I really focus on this adaptive governance. I think I was talking to one of your colleagues here, how some government agencies are completely unwilling to share data because they're risk averse. They don't want to be shown that what they're doing, their program, their solar program, or their whatever program. We've had some conversations about this too. So that's, adaptive governance means you're gathering data, you're having independent people, and you're willing to change routes, right? So I think you need to combine some picking, keeping it as technology neutral as possible, in areas where the solution is less clear, have more of this, ARPA type approach combined with just the normal support and demonstration projects, based on applications, and in some cases, procurement that is open to different solutions, right? So yeah, I think it's a hard question, but I think it's hard to argue at this point that in some sectors, at some point, some level of picking will need to happen, and has happened, in fact.
You mentioned that some of the financial tools used technologies may not work, or there's some evidence that they won't work in developing countries. So what are the reasons for that? Yeah,
so there, this is work in progress. And what we were looking at, we were using instrumental variables estimation for a range of reforms. So some of them were kind of electricity market reforms, which again happened, in the industrialized countries, so these are the sorts of things that the World Bank, for example, has been recommending, right? So there's some of those things that we're looking at are not in the list of policies that we look at, but some of them are things like feed-in tariffs. They're just other, we're not really looking, because we're looking at a global kind of data set, we're not going down in every country, but a lot of literatures can explain why we're seeing it. So there might not be the enforcement capacity, there might not be the private investment, there might not be the project development expertise, there might, there are people who are kind of connecting to the grid without paying for it, in different countries, in different geographies, you might not see the penetration of renewables or the increase in market share, or the cost of electricity, because there are other problems, other institutional situations, or their inability to pay in some places. There isn't the ability to pay or the willingness to pay. I was in an EU African Union meeting just on Monday, and the head economist of the African Development Bank was just saying, well, it's very well that the EU is giving money for projects, but then you have people, you won't have investors if people won't pay for power, right? So there is a very different setup. So I think depending on the country, the reasons that might explain why on average we're not seeing the consistent impact that we're seeing in other places is not something we're seeing, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. In some of the Latin American countries, it's a little different. Yeah.
It's a little bit related to the regional impact, and I was very intrigued by your analysis of policies that the competitiveness impacts are in general positive, the distribution impacts are in general negative. To me, the question I wanted to ask is, this is probably going to look even worse if we begin to account for the social and environmental costs of the energy transition. And I'm thinking mining, and in Congo, it's just, that's an anecdotal point of a general trend. So mining, and then the deployment of the transition from fossil-based to non-fossil in many developing countries is going to have huge impacts, distribution impacts on this kind. So are you pessimistic in that sense, or in general, is it going to be like these costs are going to go faster, going down faster because we are not accounting for the social and environmental costs of the transition?
Yeah, I mean, so this includes the cost to kind of communities that were involved in the fossil economies, mainly in the countries where the deployment is happening. But we didn't review the literature looking at. I know it's very big. So one of the Benjamin Sobakol has done a lot of work on this. I think he's just moving from SPRUT to BU. So he has been doing a lot of work on the mining side of things. I think it's going to take a little bit longer, and I think this is an area where much more effort from researchers, from development banks, the big, the 130 trillion of financing that was committed in the Global Alliance in Glasgow. I think I don't think it's going to get better anytime soon. I do think what I'm seeing is a lot of, and this is partly because I still talk to a lot of engineers in Cambridge and beyond, we're doing much more on recycling. And I think that the more we recycle lithium and cobalt and other minerals, maybe will, the scale of it might not end up being as big as it would be otherwise. But it's a very worrisome area. I haven't seen, kind of monetary estimates on obviously this child labor, people dying in Congo, and the environment, the destruction of ecosystems, and all of this. And as we know, the biodiversity climate agendas, are increasingly getting closer, but still they're not quite in the same place. So no, I think it's going to take time. This is an important area. One of my PhD students, who is now a postdoc, has actually done some work on an aspect of this. This is Clara Galeazzi, and she looked at weather growth so we are kind of moving from some minerals, like the traditional energy minerals, right? The oil and gas and some of the, catalytic converter time resources, to the new kind of energy materials, right? And what we were looking at in this work was the extent to which maybe some of these countries, okay, right now we have this very unfair situation, this harm, but maybe they will benefit, maybe they'll be able to solve it partly. I mean, that was not the premise, but one idea was, well, maybe they will benefit from this, right? So if you have a lot of cobalt and lithium and whatever, over time, you're going to be having more resources, and if you devote them usefully, maybe you can solve all kinds of problems, not just related to mining. But sadly, what we're seeing, when you actually look at who has this, the value add is always in the kind of upgrading, right? And what we're seeing is that some of the most vulnerable countries actually are not in a situation, when you look at the trade elasticities of this, they're not going to really they're not right now. Over time, they haven't been in a situation in which their gains from trade is increasing. So I'm not hopeful about that, is what I'm trying to say. So I think it has to be something else, yeah.
This is really interesting when I'm thinking. So one way to look at this is to say that some policies are bad for distributional impact, right? But I think the other way to think about it is that probably most, if not all of these policies were designed with little to no thought of distributional impact. And so I wonder if one way to look at it is by putting some thought in, could kind of almost any of the policies, or especially some of them, become better. So like the RPS is interesting, right? So like it's like half. So it'd be interesting to see, like, could you redesign the bad ones to have them look more like the good ones and have better distributional impact? I just think it's interesting, and I think it's related to what we're interested in ETI, where we're thinking also of technologies, because you could have a similar picture to this in some sense of like technology, the impact that PV has had. And so that's kind of our thought, that you need to put this distributional idea like right at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's like, it wasn't there for the policies, and that's why we see so much orange there. Whereas when on your previous slide, that's what people were thinking about.
Yeah.
So mostly came out. So anyway, I just think it's really
No, so it's absolutely, so you were, I don't, you were asking also about the ex-ante exposure. So in this paper, we just couldn't cover everything, but we do comment a little bit what explains for the same policy instrument, some positives, some negatives, and so on. In some cases, it's the method, but not most of them. In some cases, it is the time, the point in time, the maturity of the industry in a sense. But in other cases, the design of the policy. So of course, this is just a policy instrument, but the devil is in the detail. How do you adjust it? Do you have a complementary policy? So in Spain, what they did is that then they created, a bonus. So I don't even know how to say it. So just a payment to vulnerable communities to kind of reduce the distributional impacts of some of the increases in prices that we saw partly as a result of renewables. So in some of these cases, and some of it is revenue recycling for the carbon tax. So in some cases, the positive impact is because the particular policy design is actually more beneficial to those communities. So no, that's what we're in the paper, that you need to put the just transition at the center of how you design things in the first place, and also keep adjusting because it's going to be impossible to foresee everything that's going to happen. But yeah, it had traditionally really hasn't been the focus, but it has to be.
Just about to piggyback on that, just in terms of the distributions of innovations and at the speed that we have to innovate and get it out there. Have you done any work around intellectual property rights and possible frictions? I'm thinking like anti-commons kind of patent ticket kind of issues in this space. What are your thoughts on that?
So I did a little bit. I did this with Sagar. We did I worked on a background paper for the UNFCCC Secretariat on Technology Transfer. So they were asking this question, right? Because this is one of the recurring conversations in the UNFCCC. Some countries arguing for, compulsory licensing. Some, there's again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert in this, but we did write a background paper where we looked at what was the literature on this back in 2009, right? And what we saw there is, some countries requested it, some didn't. Some, like the US, opposed to having to have compulsory licensing for environmentally sound technologies in the same way that there are some cutouts for health. And what we found is that for some of the mature technology, it doesn't make a difference. So for the wind, for the solar, for all of this, they're already commodities, they're being mass produced, but it's something where for some other technologies, it might become more of an issue. We actually, I'm a lead author of the IPCC chapter on innovation. This is going to come out, the working group 3 on climate change mitigation is going to come out in April. So now there's a chapter on innovation. So this will be covered. And so we actually did have a chance to look at this literature, 10 years after the fact. Because it hasn't come out, I cannot talk about the newest thing. So there it is, but what I can see is that there continues to be a big debate on this. It's better in the long run because you have competition and all. But I think there's more and more evidence that in some cases it has been harmful for some tech. And I think here is one of the other areas where it's essential to really look for some technologies that it's an issue, and for some it might not be, just because of how it's produced. But I think we do have some evidence, and one of my colleagues who's actually in health, Suri Moon, she's at the Geneva Institute, she's looked a lot at this for health, and I think we have more work and more evidence in health than in energy, but I think in energy and environment, we're starting to have more. So I think, yeah, I think there's some evidence, but it's not unequivocal, and that's not factual technologies. There will be something I think useful there, but I think there still isn't as much research on this as it deserves.
So with the last question, we have a question from the chat box here that said, from Chris Sherman, thank you for an interesting talk. In one of your slides, you had highlighted countries where you had sourced relevant publications. There was one lone spot in Latin America. Is that French Guyana? What is going on in that country?
Yeah, so I hadn't as good. I'll have to get back to this. I don't know. Maybe they had. Yeah. Oh, it's France. Yes. That's it. Thank you. Yeah, no, I didn't. Yeah, that is France. Yeah, so France is. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you.
All right, well, it's after 5 before it's been go, but people.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're on seeing all these papers, but yeah.
Thank you.